Am I correct in understanding that you're saying that Trump's rise is not purely the result of populism as it's made out to be, for example? Many people argue that Trump has risen in many ways because of the populism that he's been able to tap, which one can argue has been linked to the jobs lost to China and industries going out of the US, etc. Is your argument that that's an incorrect representation or maybe an incomplete representation of what has caused his rise in the past?
I think that my issue with the populism narrative is really with the term populism rather than necessarily with all the bits that are put together or can differently be used to say, oh, well, that's populist or that's like populist. So, my conceptual problem with the populist narrative, as it's often deployed anyway, is that it treats nationalism or nationhood, as I use the term, as something that's alien to democracy. So that when you see evidence of nationalism and the language of nationhood in democracy, that you're seeing something wrong with democracy, you're seeing the populist version of it. And I think that's just completely ahistorical, because I think that you cannot separate out the origins of representative democracy from the rise of the nation. And that actually for a long time it was kind of pretty much well understood that there was a very strong fusion between having representative democracy and having nation states. And so then if you then say this, it's populist when we see the language of the nation, then you have to go back and say a lot of things in representative democracy were inherently populist from the start. I mean, if you go back and say, read Franklin Roosevelt's first inaugural address, it's saturated in the language of the nation. But most people who use the word populist don't want to describe Roosevelt as a populist. Now, if you then say, let's have a look at the party in American history, and this is where it's quite clarifying looking at the United States, the America that call themselves populist, the American Populist Party back at the end of the 19th century, are there pretty clear parallels between the language of the populists and the approach of the populists and Donald Trump? Absolutely. I mean, I would say that Trump is a successor in a way to the American Populist Party, with one crucial exception that I'll come to in a moment. And if you look at what the original populists did, is they combined class critiques of America with nativist appeals, particularly to whites, obviously. And that's, I think, again, what Trump was doing. If you take the border question, there's a part of Donald Trump in 2016 that sounded like Bernie Sanders did, talking about the border, which is essentially that there's class distributional consequences, that capital, so to speak, to use, or business in Trump's language, wants cheap labor and is encouraging people to come, and then effectively, in Trump's telling of it, which obviously has got some basis to it, buying support for that in Washington with donations to politicians, including to politicians who get elected saying that they're going to get tough on the border, and then when they get to Washington, go off in the opposite direction. And Marco Rubio, who was obviously a clear example of that in the way that Trump portrayed that. That's the point of overlap with Bernie Sanders. But then Trump went a whole lot further than that, and he made some fairly crudely, racist appeals to voters about keeping people of Mexican origin out of the United States. So it's with Trump it was nativism plus class. With Sanders it was class. Now, doing the nativism and class together, that is, as I say, that's got a long history in the United States. It even precedes, I think, the American populists. But I think that if you have to see the very fact of talking about the nation in a representative democracy is not the same thing as using a politician using crude nativism to try to win elections.